All right, so this morning we're shifting to interventions. And I just want to kick us off by helping us visualize the challenge. Because part of interventions is, whether it's a system or a program, and we're going to debate that deeply in a minute, is the scale and intensity of the challenge you face. And I think where we often struggle is actually aligning our interventions, whether they be systems or programs, or whether it's an intervention or a response, whatever we do when we have an indicator that we want to help change a course or support a student based on that data, we sometimes struggle by not fully comprehending the scale and intensity of that support needed, right? And we sort of say, well, we got this much support, so we'll use it. But we don't actually ask, like, is it enough, right? Or is it the right kind? So one way to help that, I think, is just to visualize sometimes the scale of what we're talking about. So here's one reference, that if we wanted to get nation's graduation rates about 83% now, had up 10 points. But to keep going, right, the goal is sort of the national stated goal is to get to 90 by 2020. Like, we're a little bit off pace for that. We have to actually pick up the pace to sort of get there. But to actually go from where we are now to 90% graduation rate, it would mean we would have to have 3 more Rose Bowls of students who are currently dropping out graduate instead. So that's actually the magnitude, right? Just 3 Rose Bowls. So that doesn't seem, for a whole nation, 3 Rose Bowls. But here's the kicker. We talked about when all means all. Who has to be in those Rose Bowls to get to 90% for all kids, not just 90% on average? Well, 4 out of 5 of those kids in those 3 Rose Bowls would be low-income students. 1 whole Rose Bowl would be African American, 1 whole would be Latino, so 1/3 each. 1 out of 5 would be English language learners. And to me, here's the kicker. 2 out of 5 would be students of disability who are also most likely, almost certainly low income, because it's 4 out of 5 are low income, and likely minority too. So 2 out of 5 of the people in those Rose Bowls to get to 90% for all would have to be low income, minority, and students with disabilities. And that's where I just wanted to start us a little bit today, that might be the height of the challenge for us just to reflect upon where are we, if we all means all, where are we with students with disabilities, right? Because the truth is, right, is not only do they have low graduation rates, they have really bad college completion rates, right? There's a new report out yesterday from the National Council for Students with Learning Disabilities, or I might not have that quite right, that acronym, and they make the case, you could argue with their methodology, that 1 out of 5 students has an attention and learning issue, and they show that those kids graduate at lower things, but when they go to college, they find they have much lower enrollments and much lower completions, and only 1 out of 5 of them are actually identifying themselves of a need of supports. Because one thing that shifts, right, is they're identified often for special education services in high school, but to get supports in college, they have to affirmatively step forward and say, I need help, and then often get tested again. So it's actually a case where the structures, right, are not well aligned yet. We talked about that yesterday. Turning the mirror on ourselves, this is a clear place where the structures are not the systems. And we also know on the graduation level that states vary wildly in their graduation expectations and requirements for students with disabilities. And partly because of that, they vary widely, and partly because they put different attention on those kids, their graduation rates vary wildly. So an interesting fact in sort of our annual Building the Grad Nation report is out today too, so it's in my mind, is that if you look at the New England states, right, which in general have relatively high graduation rates compared to the rest of the nation, and you say, who are the remaining kids not graduating? It is predominantly students with disabilities. You then also look and you see that those states are high on identifying students with disabilities. Some of them have almost 20% rates of kids identified with students with disabilities. So in this case, these states are identifying a lot of kids, but they're actually not supporting them to graduation, right? It's not like they're not identifying them, but they are, maybe even over-identifying, some people might argue, but then they don't have systems to get them to graduation. So that's, even though relatively speaking, they're seen as high-performing states. So that's just what I want to throw out briefly to people, because I know we have some folks that have thought about this, and I encourage them to speak, is if we mean all kids building pathways to adult success, and we're talking about both structural changes, turning the mirror on us, and also building supports at the scale and intensity needed for kids, where are we with students with disabilities? Do we agree this is a tough area that needs a lot of work, or some people have some bright spots out there that can say, no, just like we heard from Georgia State, there's an answer there, we just got to do it.
Yes.
Yep. Okay? Microphone.
Science around how you improve outcomes for kids with disabilities. The key is creating the political and the real context in schools to implement that science.
Yeah, just say it's for us.
I'm sorry. I said yeah, we have to do it. There's a lot of science out there regarding how we improve outcomes, employment and post-secondary education outcomes of kids with disabilities, how we keep them in school. And they're not a lot different than what it takes to keep other kids in school. But we have to create both the political will and the resources and the context within our schools to be able to implement the science. I mean, that's the challenge to me. We conduct the science in these sort of very controlled circumstances, and then you go to implement it in a school, just like teaching math or reading or whatever, and the context is not a very controlled situation, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, one of the ironies, right, is that many of the things that have now been generalized were based on research done in the special education field.
Exactly.
Peer-assisted learning, response to intervention, things that are sort of central to early warning intervention systems broadly now were actually rooted in research within special ed. And then the irony is, we've seen this sometimes in the schools we work with, is the assumption is that students with disabilities are taken care of by the IEP and the special ed structure. They have their interventions, and we don't need to put them through the early warning intervention system.
No, because most of them are in general education classrooms.
No,
and
absolutely.
so you have
Right.
to have teachers who can
I'm agreeing where
differentiate
perceptions
instruction.
get wrong.
Exactly.
Because then, for example, we talked about this, that chronic absenteeism is typically not something that finds its way into an IEP form, right? But if you then feel like, oh, they're taken care of by this thing, no one is actually looking at their attendance, and special ed students have some of the highest rates of chronic absenteeism for a lot of reasons. So,
Particular students, yeah.
all right, so we're going to go behind you. If you can pass the mic back, we'll be cooperative here.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm really glad to hear the comment. I think this is a very important issue. You know, when we talk about cultural proficiency, we talk about the need to see the difference, embrace the difference, understand the difference, instead of coming at things from a colorblind perspective. And I think looking at the list more deeply, and when I say the list, I'm talking about a high school list of kids who be on track for graduation. We need to come at it. All kids means all, but we need to understand, okay, so this child has this situation. How can we tailor an intervention to this child? Okay, this child struggles with language is EL. Okay, this child is Latino, and there may be some stuff going on culturally that we need to make sure we're thinking about. And most importantly, we need to be talking with our teachers, our administrators, and our districts so that folks own all kids and don't think the IEP's taking care of it, or, well, don't they have a sheltered workshop, or all of the wrong things that folks may stereotypically think about certain kids without really realizing, no, we've got to dig in and own each kid and have the right kind of understanding and thinking about each kid. So bravo, and I would love to hear who's doing it right so we can take a lesson from them.
Can we get over here, and then we'll come back over here? Right in front of you? Yeah. Right there. Yep.
So I'm going to speak a little bit from the higher ed side,
great.
specifically community college side, because I tell all of my colleagues at the community college, we have no room to say they don't belong here. We're open access, we're open enrollment.
Right.
If you think you're teaching students that don't belong here, you need to teach at another institution. It's the bottom line. So one of the things and again, I have a K-12 background too, so I have a very unique voice at the community college table. Right. And one of the things I tell some of my faculty and administrators is, a student with a disability doesn't mean that they have an inability. It doesn't mean that they're unable to do certain things. It just means that they oftentimes do things differently. And what we need to do is learn from our K-12 partners around pedagogy. I think oftentimes at the higher ed side, we are content specialists, and we do that extremely well. But if a student doesn't embrace the way we teach, we write them off in our mind saying they probably should not have been here in the first place. Either you're college material or you're not. So I think there's a lot of learning that can happen across the K-12 and the higher ed spectrum. But I do think that's a big challenge because I think on the higher ed side, and probably still on the K-12 side as well, but on the higher ed side, we hear about an individual who has a learning difference and we automatically think, again, they're unable and they shouldn't be here. We have a Gateway to College program on our campus, and every year my staff does a professional development with faculty. And a few years ago when we first did it, we had all of the faculty in the room who were interested in coming, and we did an entire breakdown of kind of like the demographic of our student population. And we informed them what opportunity youth were and the fact that they disengaged in high school, so forth and so on. And I began to ask them, I said, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges with students who disengage? And almost all of my faculty said they probably had some sort of learning disability or learning difference. I said, well, it's interesting. I said, we have, out of our 120 students, we have 10 students who have learning differences. I said, what do you think those learning differences were? And they said, all of them didn't know. They were like dyslexia, attention deficit, that sort of thing. I'm like, cool. I said, well, I'll let you know. Out of the 10, they all have IEPs. I said, but 9 of them have a GIEP. Does anyone know what a GIEP is? They were like, what's that? I said, this is a gifted IEP. These kids were gifted. The reason why they didn't last in these traditional schools is they were smarter than the teacher 9 times out of 10, and they got bored and they disengaged. So there's a lot of information that has to happen. I think we have to teach one another on both sides. So I think there are good solutions for K-12 on the higher ed side. I think there are good solutions for the higher eds on the K-12 side. We just have to have those conversations.
Yeah, I think it's a rich area for dialogue. I agree.
They told me I had to stand up so they could see me. My name is Legina Bost, and for 12 and a half years, I directed the National Dropout Prevention Center for Students with Disabilities, which is a funded center at the U.S. Department of Education, the Office of Special Ed Programs. And so we studied the issue of dropout among youth with disabilities intensively and worked with a number of states and schools diligently across the country over that period of time in trying to, first of all, understand the issues surrounding dropout with this population, and then to look at what can we do that is evidence-based and systematic in order to make some change in that process. And some of the lessons that were learned across that time was that many schools will start with an early warning system, but there's this controversy about what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Is it the early warning system or is it the root cause analysis? And systemically, it has to be the root cause analysis that starts first, because then you look at a number of those variables in schools and quote unquote their systems, i.e. family engagement and those other types, and those push factors and pull factors that are within the community, in understanding what your population looks like. Looking at those critical factors of, okay, with attendance, what do I really know about the attendance rates that are within my school? And how many of those variables are alterable, and how many of those can I find some outside support from my community to help to look at? And then what are those interventions that we know that have some evidence base that we can employ, and at what scale with which groups of students, which is where the early warning system comes in as an intervention at that tier to help to identify who are those kids and what's the magnitude of the issues that they're really having when you begin that drill down process. And then what are those interventions that we can put into place universally, looking at those school climate pieces and that student engagement piece, because when you think about the conversations yesterday, really looks at the need not only for the academics and the behavioral and the attendance piece, but also the need for student engagement, looking at that cognitive and that psychological engagement. Do I belong here? And we all know in all of the research around dropout, there's that process, do I belong? All right, am I welcome here? That looks at that psychological engagement. And then that cognitive, how am I able to problem solve around my environment, my coping skills, my persistence to what I need to do? And so we have to look at at the Gestalt system in and of itself, which is why it's really important and timely that we're here looking at what are those other important indicators that can push us where we need to go beyond the ABCs. And we have to look at it, we need to look at within our systems at the district level and at the state level, what do we have to offer in these areas and how can we pull it together? Then we have to do, like someone talked about, how do we get started, those pilot processes, and then look at taking what we learned from the success of those pilots and using that then to broaden our scope and to engage additional students and engage additional school systems in that process. It is not going to happen overnight. You can't do it by yourself. And you're going to have a consistent plan that looks at effective processes, effective practices, and effective people. So you're going to need to have all of that people that Bob talked about yesterday. So that's
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to take two more quickly, and then we'll go here and we'll go there, and we'll continue this in our work groups, because this is a critical issue.
In following my predecessor's thing, I'm going to stand up so you can see me. As I look at the goal, you're talking about 90%. You're not talking about everyone. And I want to stand and speak on behalf of the 10%. That's my world. That's the world that is largely going to populate our prisons and overwhelm all our social service institutions, and I would urge this group not to give up on those people. I would also urge this group to consider solutions for those children outside the school system. The school system probably cannot adjust itself to meet their particular needs. In other words, what I would say is that last 10%, you're probably going to have to do something different than what you did to get the first 90%. And I think that there are solutions, and we have had suggestions for that. But if you think about that last 10%, that is an absolute torrent of people into the criminal justice system, a torrent of people that overwhelm all our other social service institutions. Thank you.
And thank you for letting us clarify. So pathways to adult success, if we go back to our vision, is really talking about all kids, including the 10%. I was just giving us the metric to ground us that this was President Obama's goal, to get to 90% graduation rate by 2020. That was just a reference point to say it's 3 more Rose Bowls to 90. It would be plus 4 to get to 100, if you want to think about that. So it would be 7 Rose Bowls would get you to 100. So I wasn't saying that was our goal. But thanks for clarifying me, because I agree that was not clear. All right, last on the top.
Susan Weston from Kentucky. I want to describe a way to make the pipeline work really simply.
Wonderful.
In Kentucky, it's not actually wonderful.
Oh, okay.
It's a trick.
Oh.
Kentucky cohorts, each grade marches through about 55,000 kids.
Right.
Our number of students with disabilities marches through looking like about 6,000 kids. Our high school graduation rate is based on fewer than 3,000 kids with disabilities. Somewhere in high school, they got disidentified. So we're reporting a nice number. It's impressive. But it is based on dividing by a number of kids, which does not include half of the kids we thought needed the support when they walked into high school. With that trick already pulled, when we get to how many graduated ready, the answer is 624 last year. Out of the 2,500 we admitted should graduate, out of the 6,000 who were identified as they walked into high school. So we got another issue in data quality that I haven't figured out, and I haven't gotten the discussion started with my department. I asked, but it was data release month.
Yeah.
And I backed off because I actually knew they had to do the work.
Right.
But it's a discussion that hasn't started, and it'll affect all of our ability to track what's happening if that happens across the country.
Thank you. So just the one thing I'm going to say just to wrap up this, and this was just to get our minds around this intervention space and some of the challenges, but also the opportunities. So we heard this is a big challenge, but if we talk to higher ed and K-12, we both see some real challenges identified and some real bright spots of work that exists that needs to just be built upon and leveraged. There's also there's not much happening at the policy level of federal right now. There is something called the RISE Act, which has some chance, which actually is around this thing, and it's basically one of the things it's pushing for is saying if a student has an IEP in high school, they don't have to reprove in college they have a disability and need support, so the colleges should just accept that IEP as evidence of those students who are in need of supports, which potentially could help build the more continuous pipeline because they would know coming in that some of these students need these supports. So that's just a thing to keep an eye on, whether you support it or not. It is a thing that one of the few things that people think might actually have a chance in the policy domain in the current fractured state we're in. We're going to shift in interventions now to talking about how we're going to move forward. And a key thing, and we're going to talk about, again, this in more detail at the end of the day, is these work groups we're forming. They're going to basically do work between our national gatherings on a yearly basis. And the work groups are going to be, the folks with support from the core partners of PASS, really trying to come up with some of these human and technical solutions to the identified problems, so with indicators, with response systems, and with data. And what we want to do now is to get some of your feedback, and we built some framing questions for each of these work groups, which are in your folder. There's a thing which says work groups on it, and then it says work group framing questions. And I actually want you to turn all the way to work group 3, response and intervention systems. And while I do that, we're going to set up a poll so you can actually give us some feedback.
Okay. So now that everybody's in, we'll go ahead and move on to the actual poll. So these are the questions. They're a shortened version of the questions that you just received on your handout. The first, it's A through H. So what you're going to do is you're going to, after you read the questions, go ahead and answer. You'll respond first with your first choice. So Ginny, for example, ranked how we should define response and intervention as her first choice, so she hit A. You should be able to respond a second time to then rank your second one.
All right. So sometimes technology works, sometimes it doesn't. It's one of our, we're going to learn for our intervention systems. But I think through trial and error, we did get a relatively clear result, which is that we had 40% for what are the characteristics and components of the most effective response and or intervention program and systems. So we want to know what works. And are there must-haves for effective indicator and response intervention systems that need to be taken into account when building whole school improvement networks? That was number 2, which is really about how do we integrate this into what we're already doing, and are there certain structural changes, how I interpret that, and system changes schools need to do to be able to have an effective next generation indicator and response system. All the other questions got some support, which tells us there's interest for those, but the ones we see as the 2 drivers is clearly identifying the characteristic components of the most effective response intervention and systems, and how do we integrate that with what we're doing, and what do we have to do to make the system ready for the next generation indicator and response systems, and what underlying conditions are needed for schools to be able to use it, is how I would interpret that. Was the general sense of concurrence? No? Okay.
So I have a question about H. Does it only involve K-12?
No.
Okay, whole school involves higher ed?
It's a K-12 phrase, but the meaning is what does the school itself have to do to sort of
Okay,
be for this to work.
got it.
Any other comments? Yeah.
Some of us, even in round 2, were only able to vote for one, but number G is critical. And actually, if I was ranking, there would be C, H, and G, because you won't make any traction with C or H if you don't know something about G.
In a way, you can make an argument that you can collapse G and H. G is what are the challenges and opportunities in integrating indicator response intervention systems with existing student support efforts and structural improvements. So how does he integrate? So this is the things, how do we response to intervention, multi-tiered student support systems, all the other things schools are doing that are part of this, but not all of it. How do we integrate them? If you put G and H together, then you're up to 30% plus. So it's probably a good point. Any other comments on giving directions to the work group?
Well, it's probably a linguistic thing, but you really have to understand that response and intervention are two entirely different things. So if you don't understand that, we're not going to do a very good job. And then the second piece of that is we have programs/systems as if those are interchangeable, and system support programs. So we can't treat. We can develop lots of programs, and if they're not supported by systems or system infrastructure, they're never going to work. So those are things that also need to be clarified before you can do the other things.
Very
So.
nice point. So it may seem minor to have a definitional thing, but if we're not all on the same page, and this is what we're trying to broaden our thinking here by bringing in this idea of response, not just intervention. Response can be, and people can argue intervention can be preventative and reactive, but beyond that, a response can be about system change, can be about community change, right? It's a broader sense of responding to what the data says, where the need is. We're trying to get all kids through where we have to go. So yes, I mean, it's clear that it's sort of just a function without being one of the first goals of the work groups to make sure they're all on the same page. If you don't do the definition questions, you may be talking past each other. Yeah, back there.
Can I just ask how many people would have voted for what additional response systems beyond those addressing the ABCs should be considered? Just by a show of hands. So. It's the one that's not. Yeah. So sorry. Just everybody show their hands. How many would have done that? Okay. So about 40% also, 50% also.
So I want to go back to Bob's point about the definitions, and I think that there's some potential need for clarifying even bigger definitions. So we know early warning indicators, what those are. Then there are these systems that somehow help implement or help the teams then, or if there are teams, people involved to go about the connecting to the interventions, the monitoring the interventions. So before we get into like the what's the definition of response intervention, I think there need to be some more holistic clarification of what we're talking about in terms of when we're talking about indicators, what exactly do we mean and how are we containing that conversation to just be indicators versus what we do with the information that then comes out of it and kind of make sure that we're all on the same page or at least have some working definitions.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but just to kind of spring back on that, it seems to me that a lot of when we're talking about all these definitions, what's really needed and what I've struggled with in our school district is some sort of fidelity implementation tool with a rubric, because that would help us with our teams, both at a district level, at a college level, at a school-based level, really get into the weeds on what do we mean, because if we're having this conversation here across the country, you can bet in a school they're struggling with those same issues, and when there's not a guide and some sort of a rubric to help them say, oh, well, what does this actually look like, then we're going to spend a lot of time deciding whether there should be an S at the end of the word or not, and not really get to the meat of the work. And so I just think some sort of a fidelity implementation tool around what we mean would be a huge value. The other piece that I want to add is that G and H and the combining of them, really in a school or in a district, there are multiple initiatives, and I'm sure everybody's heard of initiative overload. So using this as an organizing framework versus an additional thing or an integrated thing, rather an organizing framework for how you do multi-tiered systems of support is really critical, or it will be quickly rejected as just one more solution to it just feels overwhelming when you already have a very full plate. So I would suggest thinking about it as an organizing framework for MTSS and how teams use data to talk about kids, and then the whole fidelity implementation tool of some sort that really integrates a lot of the existing work out there. So that's maybe very big picture, but that's my suggestion.
You're actually anticipating some of the core products we've hoped to. One is, we're talking about this, is building sort of a field consensus, right, which is both shared definitions and some shared tools. So that each place doesn't have to like reinvent the wheel or interpret it their own way. Because as this work grows, sometimes it's growing organically, sometimes it's growing by a state or local mandate, right? Which even gets more to things. We don't have a clear sense of what it is, then people do their own interpretation, right? And it gets, so we are definitely seeing one goal of this project effort is to build some of that common implementation rubrics, glossaries, core understandings. So we can go to a place and say, here's what the field says this means, and then we can build from there.
I was thinking, to support what was said, I was thinking there's an example in higher ed, and you might have other examples in K-12 work as well, but so around like the late 90s, colleges started playing around with what we called learning communities, and there were lots of different interpretations of what there was. There were a couple of colleges that got national reputation for doing it well, and we all flocked to them, you know, kind of like examples that we talked about yesterday. And then over time, there again became, like you said, some definitions that emerged from the field, and you know, research that supported that. Tinto did some research at Seattle Community College that was widely quoted, and so now the Washington Center at Evergreen State University in Washington has the kind of the coalesce, and anybody who, if you want to do learning communities well, they do an institute every summer. I've been to it twice. It's excellent, and that's where you go if you want to embrace this strategy of learning communities, and it's all collected, and they have a lot of online resources and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of thinking that that's maybe what we're imagining for this.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Thanks. Thanks for giving us a vision.
I want to underscore the 8% that voted in favor of E. I think we have to think of some type of outward-facing, even dashboard that allows communities, employers, higher education to participate in how we intervene and respond to students most at risk.
Thanks. Yeah. All right, any last thought before we move on to our next domain? All right, thank you. That was although we had some technology glitches, I think we still got to the heart of really good feedback from where you guys sense we need to make some real traction.